My name is Alberto Alemanno. I'm a professor of European Union law and public policy here at HEC Paris since 2009.
Hello everyone and welcome to Breakthroughs, our Knowledge at HEC meeting with HEC Paris's top research academics. I'm your host Daniel Brown. Today, after 3 years of regular exchanges with our professors, we've decided to show you the faces behind the names by filming our Breakthroughs podcasts. And what better way to begin this audiovisual series than with Alberto Alemanno. Alberto is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Union Law and Policy at HEC Paris. For a couple of decades, he's centered his research on how law and policy may be used to improve people's lives and how people should have a voice in it. As you're about to hear, Alberto focuses on designing and advocating reforms that shift power and reduce disparities in our society, notably in fields like health, the economy, law, and politics. Alberto is prolific. He's written over 60 scientific articles and a dozen books. And we're about to meet him here in the HEC Learning Center. And that's the campus venue which Breakthroughs will be making its home at the beginning of each month. Hello Alberto, it's great to have you for this first ever filmed Breakthroughs.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
As we said earlier, you've been the Jean Monnet Professor in EU law at HEC Paris since 2009. As such, you're a keen observer of European affairs and the challenges that the EU has to represent the 450 million people living in that zone. Today we're going to have a discussion about a wide array of fields that you've been covering in your academic career, which goes back, well, almost a quarter of a century. But let's start, Alberto, with current affairs before deep diving into all this research. On September the 13th, you published a tribune in the French Le Monde Daily, where you reflect on the decision by the Open Society Foundation, the OSF, to leave Europe. Why did you feel strongly enough to write this op-ed, this tribune, about this network that was set up by the Hungarian George Soros? And you say that it could spell disaster for civil society here.
Well, I would say the reason why I decided to take a public stance on the decision of this philanthropy to depart from Europe is that this is an incredible opportunity to highlight the role that philanthropy plays in society. And the Open Society Foundation historically has played an incredible role in creating the conditions for European civil society to emerge in the first place, in particular after the fall of the wall in 1989, and in strengthening the work that many NGOs, non-profit organizations do on very difficult issues, ranging from racial justice all the way to social justice, countering abuse of the market by big technological companies. And the concern I wanted to express with my thoughts, with my opinion, was simple, was to basically say, who is going to fill in the gaps now that such a big foundation that has qualitatively and quantitatively supported so much European civil society is about to depart. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that it has any individual who is wealthy enough to become a philanthropist and to give away is certainly free, remain free to reorient the giving towards new causes, towards new stakeholders. But however, he should become responsible for the many consequences deriving from such new decisions, because in this case, the level of dependence that was created between the foundation and civil society has been incredibly strong, to the point that today many organizations might risk closing the doors, and therefore nobody will necessarily take over and pursue this important work. So this is the open question, is a call for action for European philanthropy to come together and to come up with a plan B, so that French, German, and many other philanthropic institutions in Europe can come together and see how they can strengthen the support for civil society in a particular historical moment in which we see shrinking of the civic space. We see a lot of legislative frameworks that reduce the possibility to express, to gather, to check and hold accountable public institutions. So it's a very unfortunate moment for such a decision to retreat from Europe. And there are some other foundations who are considering to do the same, so to follow the path by George Soros Foundation, who has in the meantime let the témoin to his son. So there will also be an overlap between a new strategic orientation and generational transition from the father to the son.
This tribune is an example of how you regularly contribute to the public debate in the media, but now I'd like to turn to your research and begin with an extract that we've put together of a report by the Euractiv Media Network, which is specialized in EU affairs. And this goes back to 2018 and asks the questions, are we listening to the next generation?
Well, obviously young people are going to be living with the outcome of Brexit the longest, and that's young people all across Europe, not just in the UK. So it's incredibly important that young people's voices are central to the negotiation.
Young people are also not consulted. They are not asked what they want, what is the future, and not asked to actually take part in building the future.
Brexit was a really, really interesting situation because it actually revealed really structural issues in the UK as to why young people often don't vote.
So we basically try to find out a little bit more about young people's reaction after the referendum.
The Parliament has the final say on the agreements, and so the European Parliament must play its part, and it must prioritize citizens' rights and also of young people, young citizens of UK's rights.
So this report's focused on the reaction of the youth to Brexit, but it could be expanded, I believe, to the relationship between all European youth and the institutions which are supposed to represent them. And that leads me to your latest research, Alberto, which was called Protecting the Future People's Future. It's about to be published by the European Journal of Risk Regulation. And I think you can hear the concerns voiced by these generations present and guess the future ones in many ways. I mean, this goes back 5 years, but it's very contemporary. Your research says that it's an institutional problem, that our EU structures don't have the tools to make their policies future-proof. What do you mean by that?
When you look at the voice that the youth is trying to play in our society, you soon realize that basically this voice is not heard. So they have a voice, but that voice is not channeled, because if you look, for instance, at electoral turnout, the segment of the population that is less political active, is the least political active, is the youth. So in the recent elections in France, we had the majority of youth not exercising the vote. This is true for most European countries, it's true for most OECD countries, this is happening all across the world. And this is basically asking why this is happening. There's a certain disaffection vis-à-vis the democratic system, so the responsiveness existing between the elected and the electorate remains very, very limited. But more structurally, and I think this is the point that emerged from my research, we can see that our political, economic, and social system are skewed towards the present generation, and I'm talking about those who are already in middle age and who are more politically active, and they are creating certainly more accountability vis-à-vis the elected than the youth and the future generation. So in a way, our system is inherently biased against the future generations, who are basically not given a voice. Of course, they don't exist, so we don't know who should speak on their behalf, and that's the reason why in our research we are focusing more and more on the youth as those actors who should actually be empowered to speak more. So there are reforms ideas I've been advocating for, like lowering, of course, the voting age in order to make it more attractive, but also be slightly more inventive. A possibility would be to give more votes to parents. So if you have 3 kids, you should vote 3 times, simply because the weight of your vote and the possibility for those kids to be affected by the policy decision is greater. But we can become much more sophisticated and imagine that as long as you get older in life, the weight of your vote is going to be reduced, right? So if you are young, your weight, the weight of your vote should be greater.
Alberto, moving on a little bit, I think our viewers and listeners can see that your research does show often that the king is naked, that there's a certain frankness. And this goes all the way back to your own work as a researcher and academic. And I'd like to invite you and those following us to listen to your words that go back to 2016. That's when you talked to participants of a crowdsourcing week on how to renew democracy through citizen engagement and lobbyists.
A few years ago, I started wondering whether this tick box exercise was enough. And I started wondering whether the impact I was having on students and on the world was enough to be happy with my own life. And I realized at the time that education, and in particular teaching, is not very effective. But let's have a look at my papers, my research, the other half of my professional life. The situation there is also very gloomy. In average, an article written by me is read by 10 people. And the people who cite that article, probably they haven't read it. So I don't feel very comfortable with my professional life because I know I'm pretty good. I have talent to do things, but I cannot really channel that particular talent in life, in real life. I call it system failure. And the very provocative question I have for you is whether I'm the only one here to feel this disconnect between the talent I have and the need of society out there. And the big question is, how can we fill it? Of course, how can we fill it? So regardless of whether you work for corporations, as a professional in marketing, finance, management, or you work for a public administration in a government, in an international organizations, you're pretty likely to feel like me, to feel this gap, to feel that we keep accumulating knowledge and expertise and we're very good in our professional life, but we struggle in transferring this talent into the real world.
Alberto, I think we share actually the same objective in Breakthroughs of wanting to fill this gap and to bring the messages to a wider public. First of all, your reaction to this clip 7 years ago?
Well, I think that diagnosis is still holds true today. I mean, I don't think there are many more people reading my academic papers or those papers who are written here at HEC or anywhere else. What I mean is that the gap existing between academic research and reality remains very significant, and we really struggle to bridge this gap today. And we are trying hard. We are doing things like translating our research as we are doing today for a broader public. We are trying to beautify our engagement with society. We are trying to make our form of contribution going beyond the ivory tower. But at the same time, this behavior is not necessarily what is expected from academics. We are not trained to talk to journalists. We are still not trained to translate our research to policymakers. So we are a bit there in this kind of ambivalent situation in which we are expected to do a bit more than writing papers, but the incentive system still reflects this idea. So at the end of the day, we are still, I think, underutilized and not necessarily channeling this potential to transform society through knowledge in the way in which we witness. But a major difference between 2016 and now is ChatGPT, is generative AI, is the fact that there are tools today that are able to actually do in a very effective way things that might actually help to bridge that gap, but they also have exclusionary effect because they might get rid of professions. And I think this is a bit the dilemma we face. So this is the major difference probably between 2016 and 2024.
Anyway, this honesty about being not completely comfortable with even your own position has, I think, galvanized much of your research and actions. And that brings me to your second paper that we were wanting to discuss with you, which is soon to be published, and it's called The Lobbying for Good Movement. And here you've turned to a positive form of lobbying. In this study, which is coming out soon in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, you examine a new movement which shows that lobbying is an essential part of social change.
Well, lobbying is nothing else but to participate in society. So it's about reminding our political representatives who we are there, we have preferences, and that's exactly what we should do. So,
but that's citizen lobbying, yeah.
Well, everybody can do it. It can be corporations, it can be citizens. Everybody is entitled to petition its government and to remind that we are here, we are waiting for their actions. We often forget about this, but we hold sovereignty. We just delegate them on a temporary basis to our representatives. So lobbying is about that. Obviously, the word, the semantics are really heavy. They carry a very negative connotation, and this way of participating has been hijacked by the usual suspects, certain special interests that are very active in the space existing in between elections to gather the attention of the policymakers, but nothing prevents us, academics or journalists or physicians or any type of worker and individual to actually engage with political leaders. But that's exactly what we don't do. So you clearly see the link existing between my frustration in witnessing the gap between the academic environment and society, and the possibility that might be open by embracing academic lobbying or citizen lobbying or any form of participation that enable the individual and collective level to basically connect with power systems, power dynamics that are today missing what I call the missing stakeholders. I mean, those individuals who are mostly affected by those decisions, but they don't have a say, despite the fact they might be epistemically better placed than political leaders, because we know that in average society is probably more educated today than our elected representatives. So how can we get out of this situation in which we are basically wasting human capital, talents, and just following what we see?
And this is the aim of this paper, because you're trying to orientate it towards this idea of the lobbying for good movements.
Daniel had a long genesis. It's a paper I started working on probably 5 years ago, when I had an intuition that something in society, in the market, in the political system was changing. So I ran these ethnographic studies, identifying players, actors who had exactly the same vision I've been sharing with you now. So saying, well, we need to demystify and to democratize lobbying as a form of participation. And when you look at these actors, you have the usual non-profits, you have civic tech platforms and apps enabling neighbors to signal to the mayors that there's an issue in that pothole, while at the same time denouncing racial discrimination fact, while at the same time drawing the attention about inequalities in the workforce, and simply commodifying this link existing between individual lives and the political, economic, and social systems. But they are not only non-profits. You also have philanthropies, foundations that are behind the emergence of this movement. But then you also have corporations, companies that are today under unprecedented public scrutiny. They can no longer use lobbying just to promote the self-interest, to promote their bottom line. They need to take care of their environmental footprint, they need to take care of their social footprint, but also their political footprint. So what is left behind by their engagement with the political process? And all these actors, they just have one thing in common. They really think that we can flip the meaning of lobbying by empowering many more people, many more actors, by being, first of all, more transparent in the way in which they engage with the political leaders, to be more demanding in relation to what we expect from the political leaders when responding to us, and finally, democratize, giving access, equalizing access to power so that everybody can be joining the movement. So now the final line of the piece is, now the time has come to lobby for good lobbying, right? So we need to mobilize the same repertoire of tools that we have been used to promote special interests in order to advance a positive vision in society in which each of us, based on his or her talent, is able to get into the system and have a say and shape it, rather than just being a consumer, as opposed to being, a citizen, just being, somebody who goes to the movies, as opposed to being one of the characters of the movies. So it's a call for action.
Alberto, let's turn to this final paper that we'd like to talk to you about. This time it goes back to 3 years, its publication. It's called Citizen Power Europe, the making of a European Citizens' Assembly, a permanent one, you add. And in this paper, you admit your sympathies for a citizen-centric ecosystem, or in the plural, ecosystems, as we've heard throughout our exchange, as opposed to the state-driven initiative like the one that we saw orchestrated by the United States at the Summit for Democracy a few years ago. Perhaps could you first sum up what advantages there are with the former, which you've mapped out in this 20-page article that our people following us can read in the Revue Européenne du Droit, the European Review of Law.
Yeah, our political institutions are basically dating back to the 19th century, but we are in the 21st century. So it's pretty clear that they're not fit for purpose today, and there's a clear set of signs suggesting the erosion in the ability and resilience of our institutions to be responsive to citizens' demand. And we see this every single day. And the urgent need to embrace democratic experimentation, to embrace political innovations, and we try to complement representative mechanisms, meaning electoral processes, with other forms of feedback loop being built between the electorate and the elected representatives. And I call this participatory democracy. We can call it deliberative democracy, which is a subtype of participation, which basically consists in going back to sortition, so randomly selected systems that allow you to basically have a group, which we can call a mini public. That's how we call it in the literature, something that France has been experimenting with the Grand Débat, with the Convention Citoyenne, Convention Climat, that basically create a sort of soundboard for the political process to get a sense of what society wants to expect on that particular issue. And we had so many successful precedents in Ireland where the political class was absolutely unable to take a stance on major societal issues like same-sex marriage or right of abortion. So the system was blocked. The political system was unable to take a stance on this. So the genius idea at the time would say, let's convene these citizens' assemblies. Let's see what citizens want. And this opened up a space of deliberation and that empowered those individuals, but not only those who were randomly selected, so they were there basically by chance, but also the entire community, the entire society, because the media, they start assessing the pros and cons of every single option. How hypocritical it was to tolerate abortion being happening across the channels for Irish women, but not being tolerated there. Why? How could you justify this, right? So the conversation also took into account the religious concern that were also well-funded from that perspective, and put everything on the table in a very clear way. And that's exactly what political leaders should do, but they never do. They don't deliberate. They belong to tribes. The question now, and the challenge and part of my work in that paper I wrote with Calypso Nicolaidis from Oxford and the School of Transnational Governance at UI, is how can we institutionalize those citizens panels? So we have a lot of experiences at the local level, at the national level, but we don't have many experiences that became permanent, they became stable. And I wrote a paper which is related to that is really trying to create this permanent citizen assembly. So what should we do in Europe? And in a nutshell, the idea, without complexifying too much, is to have a permanent group of citizens, let's say 1,000, coming from all over Europe, who on a regular basis check what citizens are asking with petitions, complaints, letters, and they clearly come up with a ranking of issues. It might be how to regulate the metaverse, how to tackle inflation, how to improve access to social housing, and they rank them. And then they propose this to the political level. And the political level said, these are the issues where we need advice. We need a soundboard. And they would convene those on an ad hoc basis, but thanks to this, what I call the Citizens Council. So we would have this Citizens Council basically defining the political agenda that would be co-created during the political electoral space. So we vote every 5 years, but in the space in between elections, we would have yet another entry point to set the agenda by the citizens, with the citizens, and with direct contribution. So this is the intuition of deliberative assemblies and having them as a complement, not as a substitute of our representative system. So win-win, as you said correctly, in my view.
Finally, Alberto, let's turn to the exchanges that you've organized recently with fellow researchers here on the HEC campus. In mid-September, you and Professor Elie Sung invited academics from around the world to discuss whether and how interest groups lobby the courts. It's a multidisciplinary approach with a focus on researchers who are exploring lobbying, regulation in law, non-market strategy in business studies, and interest groups in political science. Why was this aspect so important to discuss between researchers here?
Right. I think access to power is basically the dominant theme in my research, as you can see. And Elie Sung at the strategy department and myself, we had this serendipitous encounter a few years ago, and we both realized that we care about focusing something that has been historically neglected, whether and how interest groups, citizens, try to influence not only the parliament, not only the government, but also courts. So judges are also object of lobbying, of influence, of participation. And this raises a very difficult political theory question, whether courts should become participatory, should be open to external input, because they've been designed to be insulated from outside scrutiny. You need to become a party to a case in order to engage with a court. But obviously, once again, we see that historically the usual suspects, special interests, have been hijacking access to courts by basically enjoying the fact that this access is subordinate to the satisfaction of a lot of epistemic complexity. You need a good lawyer, you need to tick a lot of boxes, and this is not something that everybody in society can afford. So all of a sudden, we came to the realization, in her case, in her PhD, in my case, in my subsequent articles over the last years, and also my experience, I worked in a court as a referendar, as a clerk for 5 years, that courts might have become a major locus for power influence that has major repercussions not only on the outcome of that case or that litigation, but also on policy making. To the point that if you look at the other side of the Atlantic, there are major cases, if you think about reproductive rights, that are decided by the courts. They're not decided by the legislature, and which are the result of approximately 30 years legal strategy, which does not simply consist in pushing the courts to take a stance on the 14th Amendment, but rather to create an entire legal doctrine that entail the training, the publication of academic articles that in a very subtle way shape the whole ideational and informational space for judges to grow in. In other words, this has been a long-term investment made by a particular group of people, this time not progressive, but very conservative, socially conservative, who actually won that battle. And this is happening not only in the US. In our workshop, we had the chance to have people from over 10 countries, and they were all studying, researching, reporting how this is happening in very subtle way. They suggest that the repertoire of tools available to interest group vis-a-vis courts might be even more sophisticated and even more inaccessible. And therefore, this is producing huger socioeconomic implications than the one already operationalized vis-a-vis the legislature. In other words, this is very, very nasty lobbying happening, completely hidden, to the point that this phenomenon is not even acknowledged. So we wanted to break the taboo, and we got a lot of support and encouragement by many scholars who actually responded to our call for papers and actually show up here at HEC. They spent 2 days with us discussing all the intricacies around how to conceptualize this concept of judicial lobbying and identifying the different forms, manifestations, expressions that are emerging today, but they remain under the radar.
Well, my thanks to you, Alberto Alemanno, for this exchange, which I hope will be the first of many to come.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.